The tension in the courtyard reached a breaking point as Trump continued his gentle but persistent attempt to move Wellington from his post. The guard's internal struggle was becoming more visible despite his best efforts to maintain the stoic expression that had been drilled into him through years of training. Wellington's mind was racing through every piece of protocol he had ever learned, searching for guidance on how to handle this unprecedented situation. His sergeant's words echoed in his memory. No matter what happens, you do not move from your post. You do not speak. You do not react. But those instructions had never anticipated the President of the United States physically attempting to relocate him. Ambassador Johnson was now visibly distressed, understanding better than anyone the potential diplomatic implications of what was unfolding. "Mr. President," he pleaded, "I must insist that you stop this immediately." The Queen herself could be watching from the palace windows. Trump, however, was completely absorbed in his experiment. He had increased the pressure slightly on Wellington's shoulder, not enough to hurt the young man, but sufficient to create a genuine test of his training. In Trump's mind, this was no different from any other negotiation or test of resolve he had encountered throughout his career. "Come on, soldier," Trump said encouragingly, as if trying to help someone overcome their hesitation. "Just one small step. Nobody's going to court-martial you for moving a few inches." What Trump didn't realize was that Wellington's resistance was not just about following orders. It was about something much deeper. The young guard represented centuries of British military tradition, and his position was not just a job, but a sacred trust. To move from his post without proper orders would feel like betraying every guardsman who had ever stood watch before him. The physical pressure continued, and Wellington began to show signs of real strain. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool autumn air, and his breathing became slightly more labored as he fought to maintain his position against Trump's persistent effort. Suddenly, the situation escalated dramatically. From seemingly nowhere, a sharp, commanding voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Halt!" The voice belonged to Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Whitfield, the officer of the guard, who had been observing the situation from his command post and had decided that immediate intervention was necessary. He approached rapidly, his polished boots clicking against the gravel with military precision. Whitfield was a veteran of 3 tours in Afghanistan and had been responsible for palace security protocols for over 5 years. He had dealt with numerous incidents involving civilians and dignitaries, but nothing quite like this. His face was set in an expression of barely controlled professional outrage. "Mr. President," Whitfield said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, "I must ask you to step away from my guardsmen immediately." Trump looked up, his hand still resting on Wellington's shoulder. For the first time since beginning his experiment, he seemed to fully grasp that his actions might have consequences beyond mere curiosity satisfaction. "Officer," Trump began, using his most diplomatic tone. "I was simply—" "Sir," Whitfield interrupted, his military bearing making it clear that this was not a negotiation. "What you are doing constitutes interference with a Queen's Guard in the performance of his duties. This is not acceptable under any circumstances, regardless of your status or position." The authority in Whitfield's voice was unmistakable, and even Trump's Secret Service detail seemed unsure how to respond. They were trained to protect the president, but they were also guests on foreign soil, and the situation fell into a gray area of diplomatic protocol that none of their training had specifically addressed. Ambassador Johnson seized the opportunity to try to de-escalate. "Lieutenant Colonel, please accept my sincerest apologies for this misunderstanding. I'm certain the president meant no disrespect to your traditions." But Whitfield's attention remained focused on Trump, who still had not removed his hand from Wellington's shoulder. "Mr. President, I am giving you a direct order to cease your interference with my guard. Failure to comply will result in the activation of additional security protocols." The implied threat was clear, and Trump finally understood that he had crossed a line from which retreat was the only viable option. However, his natural instinct to never back down from a confrontation warred with his recognition that he was in a delicate diplomatic situation. "Look, Colonel," Trump said, using the military title with deliberate respect, "I wasn't trying to cause any trouble. I was just impressed by your man's discipline and wanted to see how extensive his training really was. His training, Whitfield replied coldly, includes protocols for dealing with threats to the crown and disturbances of the peace. You are currently triggering both categories. The word threat hung in the air like a challenge. Trump's own security detail tensed, recognizing that the situation was moving into dangerous territory. If the British military began treating the president as a potential threat, the diplomatic consequences could be catastrophic. Wellington, throughout this exchange, had maintained his position despite the ongoing pressure on his shoulder. The arrival of his commanding officer had given him strength, confirming that his resistance was correct and that help was available if needed. Trump finally released his grip on Wellington's shoulder, stepping back with his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. All right. Point made, Colonel. Your man here has remarkable discipline. But Whitfield was not finished. Years of military protocol and respect for tradition had been challenged, and he felt obligated to ensure that the lesson was clear. Mr. President, the Queen's Guard represents over 3 centuries of unbroken service to the Crown. These young men are not tourist attractions or subjects for experimentation. They are soldiers performing one of the highest duties available to the British Army. The rebuke was delivered with such quiet authority that even Trump seemed momentarily chastened. Around the courtyard, other guards remained at their posts, but Trump could sense that every one of them was aware of what had just transpired. I understand, Colonel, Trump replied, his tone more subdued than usual. No offense was intended. Whitfield studied the president for a long moment before responding. Mr. President, intent is less important than impact. My guardsman has been subjected to an unprecedented breach of protocol, and this incident will require a full report to my superiors. The implications of that statement were not lost on anyone present. A formal report of the incident would likely reach the highest levels of both the British military and government, potentially affecting future diplomatic relations between the two countries. Ambassador Johnson stepped forward again, his diplomatic training in full emergency mode. Lieutenant Colonel, perhaps we could discuss this matter privately. I'm sure we can find a way to address any concerns without unnecessarily escalating the situation. But the damage was already done. Word of the incident was already spreading through the palace's internal communication networks. Within hours, it would reach the Queen's private secretary, and shortly after that, it would be briefed to Her Majesty herself. Trump looked back at Wellington, who had finally been able to relax slightly now that the pressure on his shoulder was gone. The young guard's face showed no expression of triumph or relief, just the same stoic professionalism he had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. Your man there is a credit to your service, Colonel, Trump said, making what appeared to be a genuine attempt at graciousness. His dedication is remarkable. Whitfield nodded curtly. Guardsman Wellington represents the finest traditions of the British Army, Mr. President. I trust this encounter has given you a fuller appreciation for those traditions. As the group began to disperse, with Johnson urgently ushering Trump toward his next scheduled appointment, the president couldn't help but cast one more glance back at Wellington. The guard had already resumed his perfect posture and 1,000-yard stare, as if the entire incident had never occurred. What Trump had learned, perhaps for the first time in his life, was that some things truly were immovable when they represented something larger than themselves. Wellington's resistance hadn't been about stubbornness or simple rule-following. It had been about honor, tradition, and a form of service that transcended individual comfort or convenience. The incident would later be recorded in the official logs of both the Palace Security Office and the diplomatic archives of the American Embassy. It would become a case study in cultural differences and the importance of understanding local customs when conducting international relations. For Wellington, the experience became a defining moment in his military career. He had faced an unprecedented test and had upheld the standards expected of the Queen's Guard. His fellow guardsmen would speak of the incident with quiet pride, and his superiors would note in his record that he had performed his duties with exceptional distinction under extraordinary circumstances. The story would eventually reach the ears of other world leaders, serving as both a cautionary tale about the importance of diplomatic protocol and a testament to the unwavering professionalism of the British military. It illustrated perfectly how even the most powerful individuals must ultimately respect the institutions and traditions that represent something greater than any single person. In the end, Trump had gotten his answer about the extent of the guards' training and discipline. What he perhaps hadn't expected was to learn that some forms of strength come not from the ability to move others, but from the determination to remain unmoved when principle demands it. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, typical London weather that seemed to hang over the city like a damp blanket. Trump had awakened early in his palace suite, his mind still occupied with thoughts from the previous day's encounter. He stood at the tall window, watching the morning shift of guards take their positions across the courtyard. After breakfast, Trump was scheduled for a private tour of the palace grounds before his afternoon meetings with British government officials. Ambassador Johnson had arranged for a comprehensive walkthrough that would include some of the palace's most historic rooms and collections. The Queen has graciously offered to show you some pieces from the royal collection that aren't normally on public display, Johnson explained as they prepared to begin the tour. It's quite an honor, Mr. President. Trump nodded, straightening his red tie and checking his appearance in one of the ornate mirrors that lined the corridor. Despite his interest in the tour, his thoughts kept drifting back to the guards he could see through the windows, standing in their traditional positions with that same unwavering stillness. As they made their way through the palace, Trump was genuinely impressed by the historical artifacts and paintings. The sheer weight of centuries of British history was evident in every room, from ancient tapestries to portraits of long-dead monarchs. But every time they passed a window or doorway that offered a view of the guards, his attention would shift. "Tell me more about these guards," Trump said to Johnson as they paused in the picture gallery. "How exactly does the whole system work?" Johnson, pleased to share his knowledge of British traditions, launched into a detailed explanation. The Queen's Guard is drawn from various regiments of the British Army, primarily the Household Division. They've been protecting the monarchy for over 350 years. The ceremony and protocols you see today have remained largely unchanged since the 17th century. 350 years, Trump repeated, shaking his head slightly. That's longer than America has existed as a nation. But, tell me, what happens if someone actually interferes with them? I mean, physically interferes. Johnson looked somewhat uncomfortable with the question. Well, Mr. President, that's generally not something that happens. The guards are trained to handle various situations while maintaining their composure, but direct physical interference would be unprecedented, especially from someone of your stature. But, hypothetically, Trump pressed, what would they do? The guards have specific protocols for different scenarios, Johnson explained carefully. If someone poses a genuine threat, they would respond appropriately. But, for minor disturbances, they're trained to maintain their post, and bearing regardless of external factors. Trump absorbed this information as they continued the tour. They visited the throne room, where the ornate chairs seemed almost modest compared to some of the furniture Trump had in his own properties. They explored the white drawing room with its elaborate decorations and priceless artifacts. But, throughout the tour, Trump's mind kept returning to the guards outside. There was something about their absolute stillness that both impressed and bothered him. In his world of constant motion, negotiation, and change, such rigid adherence to tradition seemed almost foreign. As they concluded the formal tour, Trump noticed that their route would take them back through the main courtyard where several guards were posted. It was now mid-morning, and the autumn sun had managed to break through the clouds, casting long shadows across the gravel paths. "Mr. President," Johnson said, checking his watch, "we have about 20 minutes before your next appointment. Would you like to return to your suite to prepare?" "Actually," Trump replied, his eyes focusing on a guard station near the center of the courtyard, "I'd like to take a closer look at the grounds. Get some fresh air before the meetings." Johnson nodded, though something in Trump's tone made him slightly uneasy. The president's staff and security detail followed as they made their way outside into the crisp morning air. The same guard from the previous day, Wellington, was back on duty at his post. His relief shift had ended, and he had returned to what was considered one of the most prestigious assignments available to the Queen's Guard. He stood with the same perfect posture and expression as before, his rifle held at precisely the correct angle. Trump approached slowly, his footsteps crunching on the gravel. His entourage maintained a respectful distance, though his Secret Service agents remained alert and positioned for quick response if needed. "There he is again," Trump commented to Johnson. "Same fellow as yesterday, I believe." "Very possibly, Mr. President. The guards often work rotating shifts at the same posts." Trump stopped about 3 feet away from Wellington, studying the young man with the same fascination as before. But today his curiosity had evolved into something more active. The president had spent the previous evening thinking about the nature of such absolute discipline, and he had developed some theories he wanted to test. "Good morning, soldier," Trump said, his voice clear and authoritative. As expected, Wellington showed no reaction whatsoever. Trump waited a moment, then tried a different approach. "I'm the President of the United States," he announced, as if the information might somehow pierce through the guard's trained indifference. Still nothing. "Sir," one of his Secret Service agents said quietly, "perhaps we should continue with the schedule." But Trump was now fully committed to his experiment. He had always been someone who pushed boundaries, and the absolute nature of the guard's discipline presented an irresistible challenge to his natural instincts. "I wonder," Trump said, more to himself than to anyone else, "just how committed you are to staying in that exact spot." Johnson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the London weather. "Mr. President, I really think we should respect the traditional protocols here." Trump looked back at his ambassador with a slight smile. "Oh, I respect tradition, Woody. But I also believe in testing assumptions. In business, you learn that what people call impossible is often just untested." The president took a step closer to Wellington, now standing close enough to see the fine details of the guard's face. The young man's eyes remained fixed on the middle distance, his breathing controlled and steady. "You know," Trump said conversationally, as if speaking to a friend rather than a motionless guard, "I've moved a lot of immovable objects in my time. Buildings, regulations, people's opinions. It's all about understanding leverage and motivation." Without warning, Trump reached out and placed his hand on Wellington's left shoulder. The contact was firm, but not aggressive, more like a gesture someone might make when trying to get another person's attention. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Wellington's training had prepared him for many things, but direct physical contact from a foreign head of state was not among the scenarios covered in standard protocol. For the first time since taking his post, his eyes flickered, just for a moment. But it was enough to show that the president's action had registered. "Interesting," Trump observed, noting the slight reaction. "So you are human after all." Johnson stepped forward urgently. "Mr. President, please. This is really not appropriate given the diplomatic context of your visit." But Trump was now fully engaged in his experiment. The slight reaction he had observed in Wellington had convinced him that the guard's discipline, while impressive, was not absolute. In Trump's experience, everything and everyone had limits. "I'm not trying to be disrespectful," Trump said to Johnson without taking his eyes off Wellington. "I'm just curious about the mechanics of the whole system. How far does this training really go?" Trump's hand remained on Wellington's shoulder, and he could feel the slight tension in the young man's muscles. The guard was clearly struggling to maintain his composure while processing this unprecedented situation. "Let's see what happens if we try something a little more direct," Trump said, his voice taking on the tone he typically used when closing a difficult business deal. Before anyone could react, Trump gently but firmly began to apply pressure to Wellington's shoulder, as if trying to guide him to take a step to the left. It was the kind of gesture he might use when directing someone's attention to a particular view or object. The result was electric. Wellington's entire body went rigid with the effort of maintaining his position against the gentle but persistent pressure. His face remained expressionless, but the strain of resisting the president's attempt to move him was visible in the set of his jaw and the tension around his eyes. "Mr. President," Johnson exclaimed, his diplomatic training warring with his growing panic, "you must stop this immediately." But Trump continued to apply gentle, steady pressure to Wellington's shoulder, testing the limits of the guard's training and discipline. It was not violent or aggressive, but it was undeniably an attempt to physically move the young man from his assigned position. Wellington's training told him to remain absolutely motionless regardless of external circumstances, but No manual or instructor had prepared him for a situation where the President of the United States was actively trying to physically relocate him. The contradiction between his orders to remain stationary and his natural human response to physical guidance created a moment of profound tension. The other guards posted around the courtyard remained at their positions, but Trump's security detail was now on high alert. The situation was unprecedented in the modern history of Anglo-American diplomatic relations, and no one was quite sure how to respond. What none of them could see was that palace security officers were watching the entire encounter from strategic positions around the courtyard, and that emergency protocols were already being quietly activated. The Queen's protection detail had never encountered a situation quite like this, and they were preparing for multiple possible scenarios. Trump continued his gentle but persistent attempt to move Wellington, fascinated by the guard's struggle to maintain his position while dealing with this unexpected challenge to his training. The moment had become a test of wills between centuries of British military tradition and the unpredictable nature of American presidential diplomacy. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would test the very foundations of protocol, tradition, and international relations. The autumn air in London carried a crisp bite as Donald Trump stepped out of his armored limousine at Buckingham Palace. The year was 2019, and he was making his second state visit to the United Kingdom as President of the United States. The golden gates of the palace gleamed under the pale British sun, and the red-coated guards stood motionless at their posts like living statues. Trump adjusted his navy blue tie and smoothed down his distinctive blonde hair as he surveyed the scene before him. The pomp and ceremony of British royalty had always fascinated him, though he often felt it was somewhat outdated compared to the modern efficiency of American leadership. His entourage of Secret Service agents, diplomats, and staff members formed a protective bubble around him as they approached the palace entrance. "Magnificent, isn't it, Mr. President?" said Ambassador Woody Johnson, the American representative to the United Kingdom, who had been briefing Trump on protocol throughout the morning. Trump nodded, his eyes scanning the ornate architecture and perfectly manicured grounds. "Impressive, very impressive, though I must say, Trump Tower has better security features." As they walked along the gravel path toward the main entrance, Trump noticed something that caught his attention. One of the Queen's Guard, a tall young man in his early 20s, stood perfectly still in his traditional red tunic and tall black bearskin hat. His rifle was held at a precise angle, and his face showed no expression whatsoever. The guard's name was James Wellington, though Trump would never learn this detail. Wellington had been serving in the Coldstream Guards for 3 years and took immense pride in his duty. He had been selected for palace duty based on his exemplary record and unwavering discipline. Standing guard at Buckingham Palace was considered one of the highest honors a guardsman could receive. Trump slowed his pace as he approached Wellington's position. The president had always been fascinated by displays of military precision, though he sometimes questioned whether such rigid formality was practical in the modern world. He stopped directly in front of the guard, studying the young man's stoic expression. "Remarkable," Trump murmured to Ambassador Johnson. "How long do they stand like this?" "Usually about 2 hours at a time, Mr. President," Johnson replied quietly. "They're not supposed to move or speak while on duty." Trump tilted his head, intrigued by this human statue before him. He had encountered honor guards before, but something about the British tradition struck him as particularly theatrical. The president took a step closer to Wellington, who remained perfectly motionless despite the growing attention. "Sir, we should continue to the entrance," suggested one of Trump's security detail, a tall man with an earpiece who had been watching the surrounding area with professional vigilance. But Trump was now thoroughly captivated by the guard's discipline. He wondered what it would take to break such focus. In his business dealings, he had learned that everyone had their limits, and he was curious about where this young soldier's boundaries lay. "One moment," Trump said, raising his hand to pause the group's movement. He leaned slightly closer to Wellington, studying the guard's face for any sign of recognition or reaction. There was none. The president's curiosity got the better of him. He had always been someone who tested boundaries, whether in business negotiations or political dealings. The idea of this young man standing so rigidly still struck him as both admirable and somewhat absurd. "Hello there, soldier," Trump said in a normal speaking voice, loud enough for Wellington to hear clearly. The guard's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, showing no acknowledgement of the president's greeting. Trump waited a moment, then tried again, this time with more volume. I said hello, young man. Still nothing. Wellington's training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation. Tourists, dignitaries, and even other world leaders had attempted to get reactions from the Queen's Guard over the years. The protocol was clear: maintain position and composure regardless of external distractions. Ambassador Johnson shifted uncomfortably beside Trump. Mr. President, the Queen is waiting for us inside. Perhaps we should. In a minute, Woody, Trump replied, his attention still focused on the motionless guard. He had encountered many forms of protocol and ceremony throughout his career, but this level of rigid discipline seemed almost inhuman to him. Trump decided to test the guard's resolve further. He stepped to his right, moving partially into Wellington's field of vision. The guard's eyes remained fixed on the middle distance, as if Trump didn't exist at all. Impressive training, Trump commented to his entourage. But let's see how far this goes. The president reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, aiming it at Wellington as if to take a photograph. This was a common tourist behavior that the guards were trained to ignore, and Wellington showed no reaction to the device pointed in his direction. Trump lowered the phone and studied the guard again. The young man's breathing was so controlled and steady that his chest barely seemed to move. His grip on his rifle remained firm and precise, and his posture was as straight as a steel rod. You know, Trump said to Johnson, I've dealt with some pretty stoic negotiators in my time, but this is something else entirely. The president's security detail was growing increasingly restless. They had a schedule to maintain, and the Queen's own protocol officers were likely monitoring their arrival time. But Trump seemed determined to continue his impromptu study of British military discipline. Trump took another step closer to Wellington, now standing just 2 feet away from the guard. At this distance, he could see the fine details of the young man's uniform, the precise pleating of his tunic, the gleaming buttons, and the way his bearskin hat cast a slight shadow over his eyes. I wonder, Trump mused aloud, what would happen if someone actually tried to move one of these fellows? Johnson's face went pale. Mr. President, I really must advise against any experimentation with the Queen's Guard. The protocol is very specific about. Relax, Woody, Trump said with a dismissive wave. I'm just curious about the mechanics of the whole thing. This is fascinating stuff. But Trump's curiosity was building to something more than mere observation. Throughout his life, he had been someone who pushed against established norms and challenged conventional wisdom. The sight of this perfectly motionless human being struck him as an irresistible puzzle to solve. He looked around at the palace grounds, noting the other guards posted at various positions. They all maintained the same rigid posture and absolute stillness. It was like a living museum of military tradition, frozen in time. Mr. President, his lead Secret Service agent said firmly, we really need to proceed to the entrance now. Trump nodded absently, but his mind was still working through the implications of what he was seeing. Here was a system of discipline and tradition that seemed almost mechanical in its precision. Part of him admired it, while another part wondered if such rigid adherence to form might be holding back progress and efficiency. As the group finally began moving toward the palace entrance, Trump cast one more glance back at Wellington, who remained as motionless as ever. The president's wheels were turning, and those who knew him well might have recognized the look in his eyes as the same expression he wore when contemplating a particularly challenging business deal. The encounter would stick with him throughout the formal ceremonies that followed. Even as he shook hands with Queen Elizabeth II and participated in the elaborate state dinner, part of his mind kept returning to that young guard standing perfectly still in the autumn air. What Trump didn't know was that his brief interaction with Wellington had been observed and noted by palace security. The Queen's protection officers maintained detailed logs of all interactions between visitors and the guards, and Trump's prolonged attention to one particular guardsman had not gone unnoticed. As the evening progressed, and Trump settled into his accommodations at the palace, he found himself still thinking about the guard's unwavering discipline. It represented something both admirable and puzzling to him. a level of institutional control that seemed to transcend individual personality or preference. The stage was set for what would become a much more significant encounter the following day, when Trump's curiosity about British military tradition would lead him to make a decision that would test the very foundations of centuries-old protocol.